After 3 days of meetings, a deal was struck between the federal and provincial governments and hereditary chiefs in Wet'suwet'en territory in northern British Columbia. The First Nations will review and ratify the agreement drafted over the weekend. Civil unrest erupted across the country over the proposed coastal GasLink pipelines. To help us understand the issue at heart and how our government has handled the issue so far, we have in our studio Mr. Levi Samson Beardy, an elder with Oji-Cree First Nations from northwestern Ontario. Please join me in welcoming him to the show. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
All right, so before we go into how our government is handling it, why don't you help us frame the issue from your point of view? What really is the issue?
The issue in BC at the moment is that there was a First Nations area, and there was a pipeline that needed to come through, but they refused it. The chief and council said it was okay, and others said it was okay, but the hereditary chiefs said no, it's not good for the community. So for that area, so that they're the ones that started that process, and there's a difference between the chiefs that are voted in. They're called, in my language up north of Thunder Bay, is that Okama. That's the name for a chief. But for the ones that were put into power through the electoral process by the government in the 50s, in the 40s, and so on, are called the Okamakan. They're the ones made chief. Now there's a difference between the two types of leaders. The elected ones have a mandate to work within a specific period of time during the time that they're elected, whether it's 2, 3, or 4 years. So that they're under stress to make sure that they do things to get reelected again. Now, the majority may not be like that, but there can be that tendency to focus on that time period. While the hereditary chiefs have a long understanding of history back, and they have sort of a looking ahead a little bit further and say the decision that is being made here has nothing to do with me being elected, but it's for the good of for the people and around the surrounding areas. And maybe I can even expand it to say for the good of Canada, if their vision is that large. And so this is where they're coming from. So to do two different types of leadership mindsets. One elected, one saying, what's the best thing for this area? So I make it sound like the hereditary chiefs have a noble calling. And I believe that was the basis of our First Nations in the past, was that decisions were made not just by popularity but the person or the individual or the popularity of an idea, but looking at what was the best overall for the people.
So in your opinion, what do you think is the thinking behind this? Because for the rest of the people, they don't seem to understand what the local indigenous issues are. They might just look at this issue and say, having a pipeline is good for Canada. It is good for the people of Canada. What possibly could be wrong with this? Like what is it that they are thinking that the rest of us in Canada need to be aware of?
Some of the issues that have been patterns working with the government in the past, I'm just going to talk to the public for this, is that in many cases there will be a government decision on a reserve without consultation with the people. But sometimes they go outside, and this is the worst case scenario where they'll phone somebody in the community and say, well, what do you think of that? And then they'll say, well, we did consult with them, but it wasn't an official person that they really did talk to. It might be a lower official person, but they use that as an excuse. The idea is to have concentrated discussion with the people within that community. And in this case, they did with the chief and council, the elected chiefs and council. But somewhere the communication between the elected chiefs and the hereditary chiefs was missing. And I don't know the full details of that. But in most communities, there's no voice from the hereditary chiefs at all. They're almost non-existent, to tell you the truth. So this is an unusual case, and especially with BC, where they did not have treaties. They were considered territories or reservations by themselves, that they owned this land and Canada was going to be around them. So for them, their issue was this pipeline will affect them in a terrible way if anything happens. So that's where they were looking at the long-range picture. And the idea in First Nations that has come out strongly in the past while and has been there for years is for leaders to look not just on a short-term 5-year plan or even a 10-year plan, but 7 generations. How is this going to affect our people for the next 7 generations? So when you look at a pipeline being established, yes, it may be good for 4 or 5 or 6 years, but then the process of the pipeline being taken care of, that's something that is going to be detrimental sometime in the future, where decay and rot or rust may cause problems. So I think maybe that's where the hereditary chiefs are looking at. But it's also that in-depth discussion that is needed to get a consensus, not just an electoral decision, but a consensus from the community as to what is best.
Okay, so I know in a democracy, that's what we like to do, is to have a consensus, have the voice of the people heard. But somebody could say, having a pipeline go through your territory is no different from having a road that has to go through, somebody's property for that road to be built. Yes, it's going to affect that one person or whoever else's properties along the way, for which they're going to be compensated. That's how we call it expropriation. But then if we were to look at everything, there would be no roads that would be built, right? So
correct, yes.
there is something called a greater good, for the community, of the country. So I don't fully comprehend and understand the issue at heart. But perhaps what I'm hearing you say is it's not so much that you are putting your pipe through our property or something, that a land that belongs to us. The issue is also that you did not consult us. Like, you're not giving us the respect that we deserve as Indigenous people. That's
right, yes. So there might have been discussion, but not a decision, a solid decision. Now, looking back on past occurrences, and our people have been shoved into little corners of this province, that area, land many times that is undesirable and really not profitable for us as a whole. But for the good of the nation, we've allowed ourselves to be shoved onto these, what we call back home, reservations, but in our language it means, the word we use is Ushkunagan. And Ushkunagan means leftovers. We're put into areas that are just left over that the rest of Canada doesn't want. And one example that cropped up in the late 1980s and was with the Oka, with the Mohawk people in the Montreal area, in Kahnawake, where Oka, the city, wanted to build a golf course on Mohawk land. That was a sacred burial site, a sacred site. And to go back to the Mohawks and look at the past, they had moved 5 times in over a couple hundred years for the good of Quebec and for the community. Now here, this was the last straw. They were being asked to move again or give up part of the land. And there was a major crisis. There was, the RCMP or the Surete de Quebec was called out, the police force, then the RCMP because it escalated, and then the army came in, and so there was fortunately no one got killed, but
there was some
beatings. There were beatings that happened, and the Mohawks won that area, that situation, but it shouldn't have had to go that far, and so I'm glad that. Well, and there were other situations that happened, but
Did
a treaty. I'm not sure if we learned. I'd like to say we learned because we haven't jumped onto the BC case as harshly as we did with Oka, where that happened with Oka. So, but I want to give an example of the word treaty that we have here with our First Nations people.
So before we go into that, let's give a little background, because a lot of people don't understand that there are treaties
So that's what I'm getting at.
Yes.
There was, in the early years, when the Europeans and the First Nations people met, they agreed to discuss things with each other on a nation-to-nation basis. And Hollywood and the U.S. experience always shows that the Native people were conquered and their lands were taken away. But that's not the case here in Canada. In Canada, it was nation-to-basis treaties. We will share this land, we'll have this part, and that's where we'll be. And we'll rule our own area. But somehow that morphed into an area where all of a sudden we were a kept people. We were sort of like wards of the country, wards of the Queen. And so all of a sudden, bureaucrats in Ottawa started to think, well, we can make decisions for them. And for a while it happened. But the detriment to us was we were not allowed legal counsel. We were not allowed to have businesses. We were not allowed to work off there to raise a financial foundation for ourselves. So we had nothing to go on except to survive. But recently we've been allowed to vote. We're allowed to go to universities and to live off the reserve and so on. So now we've started to find our strength. And I think the utmost was here, where across the nation, Native people stood up in solidarity with the Wet'suwet'en people. And so that's amazing.
Really?
And I think that's
Yes.
powerful.
And there was a poll that came out today that says Canadians are not really happy with the way the government has handled the situation.
Yes.
In your opinion, what do you think our government should have done? Or, as I alluded to before, did we learn anything from the Oka crisis? And what is it that you expect the government to do? What is it that you want the Canadians to know about this situation?
I would like Canadians to know that we have rights through the United Nations Constitution. We have rights as Indigenous people. And many times some of the lawsuits that we had for lands claims and so on have had to go to the World Court. And we've always been found to be the ones in the right because we've kept our end of the bargain with the treaties. Canada has always seemed to renege on their aspects. And it goes back to the human condition. The human condition is there where two people agree on something and they have a treaty or an agreement, and always after a while it gets forgotten and gets messed up. And I'd like to go back to the time in the Old Testament with Moses. Okay. Well, even before that, with Joseph, who was with Egypt and became a ruler in Egypt under a Pharaoh. And there was good relationship. So they were given a piece of land called Goshen, where the Israelites could live, and the Egyptians could live here. But 400 years later, all of a sudden, the Egyptians had these people in bondage, working to build all their infrastructure for their nation, and they were under extreme pressure as slaves, as opposed to being a nation to nation. They're slaves 400 years later, because the Egyptians had forgotten the original agreement. Yeah. And in this case, it's the same thing here. Canada has forgotten the original agreement. And as new people come from around the world, all they see is the government's perspective. They don't see the First Nations perspective, where we helped build this country. And there was a big fight about 30 years ago where Elijah Harper, who was a member of Parliament, the federal Parliament, had to stand in the Commons with a feather, fighting against what was supposed to be the fact that Canada was built on two founding nations, the French and the English. And he said, hold it, we were here first and we're part of that process. So he fought to have us included as part of the founding nations. So that's a plus. So they listened to him, but he had to uphold or put a standstill to the Parliament proceedings to get that addressed and done. And so there was discomfort amongst the people at the time. And same as there was discomfort in Canada here because of the blockades across the nation. But the thing is, we have been at discomfort for hundreds of years. The rest of Canada has been a discomfort for how long? A week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks? You know.
This is civil disobedience is part of democracy.
Yes, right. Yeah, to get it right done, and I'm glad there wasn't. I was talking with one person, a non-native person, about these issues, and I could see him. You know, he was very much against Native people at the beginning of the conversation, and I just told him these are the injustices we've had to put up with, discomforts and so on, and racism, discrimination, and oppression. And after telling him about it, just half an hour, just listening to these things, I wasn't arguing, I was just stating the facts. And he's there, he got all mad, and just eyes bulging out and turning red. And I thought he was going to hit me. But he says, well, you guys got to do something. You got to blow up bridges or something. And I said, hold it. We don't want to go there. But you know, we have a right to blow up bridges, but we dare not do that because then we're violating our own, I would say, code of ethics. Yes, we want to create awareness, and there may be discomfort in creating that
civil
awareness.
disobedience, as I said, is an essential part of democracy. To be able to say, "Hey, listen, I need to draw your attention to something." That's what it is. I mean, people who do destructive things, well, that's not how we do things here in Canada. I don't think people are upset about that. Moving forward, I know history tells us there is a lot of injustice that has taken place. Treaties have not been respected, you know, Indigenous people's rights have not been respected, as you mentioned. We can spend our entire life talking about all the injustices, and there have been a lot.
Can I talk about the word treaty? We think sometimes we're only involved in the political process when we sign a treaty with a nation to nation. And I think there's something more to it than that. And I'd like to give an example of from the Old Testament again. Joshua going into the promised land to Canaanites, and God was giving them that land. So they went in, and they conquered Jericho and Ai. But then a group of people within that area, the Gibeonites, and this is in Joshua chapter 9, verses 1 to 23. The Gibeonites were scared, and they said, we're going to be destroyed too. So they pretended to be people from a long distance away that were coming in. They had moldy bread, they had moldy cheese, everything, and the wine sacks that were decaying. And they said, we're not part of this group. Could we sign a treaty with you? And so on, because we believe you guys are in the right. So it says that Joshua said, okay, we'll sign a treaty with you. So the treaty, a political treaty, okay? And so they did. But then 3 days later, they found out these guys had done this as a ruse, had lied to them. They were from that area. But they'd signed the treaty. And their first thought was, well, we can just break the treaty, but no, they didn't. And they signed that treaty because they did not consult God first. So now here in a treaty, how involved is God in the treaty? It seems he is, according to this. And so, but the Gibeonites were punished by the Israelites, saying, okay, you'll be water carriers and gathering sticks and wood for us. So you'll be our servants more so than anything else. So that was okay, that was understanding was there. But then later on, in 2 Samuel, there's an issue where the Israelites all of a sudden have 3 years of continual famine and drought and problems. And they pray, and all of a sudden God tells them, it says, it is because you have violated the treaty with the Gibeonites. You have gone out and tried to kill them. And because of that, God is mad at you. So you're looking at a seemingly inconsequential treaty between two nations, but because one of them violated it, now God is saying this is not right. You're going to pay for this.
Is there a parallel between this and what's happening in Canada?
I would think there is.
Okay. What is that?
I think Canada has gone through major problems at various times in its existence, because I believe that they have been violating their treaties, whether it's been, I can go back years of sicknesses, of famines and problems and droughts and so on. And I could list them, horrendous. Like, we might think those world wars were just world wars, but how many Canadian young people died in those wars?
A lot of them.
And you think about England as part of this whole treaty process, because it was the Queen of England that we did with, and you think of the Blitz of London. Is that part of that? All this turmoil and the whole British Empire falling apart, because maybe they're more than the treaties with the native people that they're violating, but other nations, other colonies, I guess. So the fact is, and I believe strongly, that prayer in the churches has been amazing. Okay, that God hears those prayers. And it could have been so much worse without those prayers. But because still the violation of those treaties, breaking the bond of trust between nation to nation, people to people, that there had to be the government of God that says there's going to be hardship because you just do this. Because the Israelites here weren't destroyed for violating the treaties. They had hardship, 3 years of famine, just for an inconsequential tribe.
So talk to us. What do we as Canadians, starting with our government, need to do to make sure we don't come under judgment? Yeah. Because what I'm hearing you say is that even though this was a political treaty between two nations or nation to nation, but because it is a treaty, it has a higher power that holds you accountable.
That's right. Yes.
Right? That higher power is God. And so whenever you violate that treaty, there is a consequence.
That's correct.
Right?
That's correct.
So what do we need to do as Canadians, and what does our government need to do to make sure that we don't come under judgment?
In a previous episode of this program, we talked about the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples that was done in 1986 that came out. So there were recommendations there on what needed to be done to correct many of the problems. Plus the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that has recently been established, and the recommendations that came from that. Those are the things that have to be set in place. And our First Nations people are a part of Canada. We're a part of Canada, and we'll continue to be a part of Canada. And we as our First Nations people, I talked to some chiefs and many chiefs. I've been to the Assembly of First Nations since meetings at many times, and I hear the heart of our people that want the best for all concerned, not just for First Nations. So our mandate is to recognize that Canada is part of us, and we are part of Canada. And we would like to be our own people, but to be able to bless the greater country as a whole. And sometimes, what needs to be done is to look beyond our situations without having to sell out our things, but work out a situation to better the situation for all concerned. And I think that's what was missing in Wet'suwet'en, was that, yes, what's good for Canada was placed on the community, but there was not enough research to show what could be done to help both the people there and the greater country. And I think there's always a way. And I'm wondering, I really am wondering, was God consulted in this? As Joshua made the mess in the promised land because he chose not to consult with God. Are we making a mess here if we're making decisions not consulting him? That's a big thing.
All right, well, now you've had a different perspective on, and I hope that you've been able to have a better understanding of what is going on. And if you are from a First Nations community, what we want to say to you is that, we understand to the best of our ability your pain and what you've had to go through. And we are all standing together as Canadians to see that this nation moves forward and all our issues are resolved, as families do, sit down at the table and talk about these issues. And so thank you so much for coming once again and for giving us this great perspective. You don't go anywhere. Lots more for you.
I am Jay Banerjee, and I thank you for reaching out to me. I'm a real estate pre-construction condo specialist. I have a special relationship with the builders, which allows me to get you special access, front of the line access to real estate properties downtown Toronto, in the city of Toronto, in the outskirts, Yonge and Eglinton, on the borders, North York, GTA. You want to invest? You know about the interest rates. They have been coming down. You know all about what's happening in the real estate market. The real estate market is on fire. Now is your time to call me. I can help you to get a pre-construction condo when others don't have the access. Why wait in line? Why just send in all these worksheets and nothing happens? I am Jay Banerjee, and I have a special relationship which gets you front of the line access into the pre-construction condo world, which means money in the bank for you. Your future retirement is depending on a good real estate agent like myself. Call me, Jay Banerjee, Remax Realtron, 647-273-1119. I will help you.